Hey everyone, it's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for hanging out with us today as we go over a few swaps to the Unrestricted Cube. The next standard set, Kaldheim, is still about a month away and we've been itching to make a few changes. So we're going to do a smaller update to work out some of the kinks in the cube while we wait for Kaldheim to drop. We've got around 15 swaps to talk about, but before we do, drop below and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on future changes to our cubes. And if you're a new member looking to join our growing Discord community, we'll have links below as well. Alright, let's talk cube updates. Kicking things off, we've got Toolcraft Exemplar coming in for Priest of Iona. We more or less assumed Priest of Iona would be a 2/2 often enough that it was worth including as an aggressive white creature, but as it turns out, having to put in work to build your own Isamaru isn't exactly an accomplishment. After two rotisserie drafts where we saw this card go dead last in a pool of 450 cards, it became obvious that we needed to cut it. Toolcraft Exemplar is a similar card as a dorky 1-drop that gets better with the right support. The thing is, Toolcraft Exemplar becomes a 3/2 with any artifact on board, where Archpriest becomes a 2/2 with a small subset of specific creatures on board. The upside is just better, and there are plenty of reasonable artifacts to play on turn 2 that you're happy to follow up the Exemplar with. Don't be fooled, we're not pushing some white artifact deck. We just think white aggro decks are happy to play cards like Heart of Kirin or Scrap Heap Scrounger, to name a few, which pair very well with the Dwarf. Another swap in the white aggro section is Ancestral Blade for Knight of Grace. Knight of Grace is a fine card, but fine is its ceiling, and we were comfortable cutting it for something a little more unique. Ancestral Blade is a glorified 2/2 with some staying power against removal, but the real reason we're including this is in anticipation of Kaldheim, where we expect to pick up at least one more powerful piece of equipment. With the already spoiled Halvar on the horizon and access to cards like Zendikar Rise and Nahiri, we feel like a Boros equipment sub-theme could come together as a bit of a mini archetype in the cube. Embercleave and Maul of the Skyclave are both very powerful colored equipment, so we decided to jump the gun and see if Ancestral Blade has what it takes to make an impact in the cube, since it's something we'd likely be interested in anyway if the equipment sub-theme pans out. Our next swap is a bit of a placeholder, with Ministrant of Obligation taking Mentor of the Meek's spot. In my eyes, Mentor of the Meek is a relic of the past, an early attempt at giving white a form of card advantage that hasn't kept up with Magic's power level since its release. The Unrestricted Cube isn't blisteringly fast or anything, but white decks don't have a ton of time to sit around casting small creatures and dumping extra mana into drawing a few cards. White Weenie's game plan needs to focus on making its creatures into better attackers and removing your opponent's roadblocks. It usually can't spend time on incremental card advantage, and Mentor of the Meek's 2/2 body doesn't provide the utility you would want out of this type of card. Ministrant of Obligation is a small nod to black-white aristocrat style decks, but as I said, it's more of a placeholder. We've got our eyes on Bygone Bishop whenever we get the Shadows over Innistrad remaster, since that card fills Mentor's role, but on a much more useful body. But for now, Ministrant will serve as a marginal playable for sacrifice-based decks. Our next swap comes courtesy of our admin team, as they pointed out that the 4-mana blue card draw section seemed a bit crowded. As such, we're removing Reign of Revelation for Thirst for Knowledge. Again, don't let this trick you into thinking there's a blue artifact deck floating around. Occasionally, you'll have a spare artifact to power up your thirst, but this change is intended mostly to break up the cluster of 4-mana draw spells in blue. Reign of Revelation isn't a bad card by any means, but we felt like blue could use a good draw spell at 3, and we landed on Thirst for Knowledge as a good card selection tool that you can cast earlier in the game. Speaking of not having an artifact theme in blue, we're removing Tezzeret Master Artificer for Glasspool Mimic. Tezzeret, despite being a fine generic planeswalker, suffers from a couple things in this cube. For one, we've got plenty of blue planeswalkers that have card advantage covered in spades. Second, we don't have the artifact support to make Tezzeret really shine. And third, blue is rife with powerful win cons, and Tezzeret falls flat by comparison. He's more of a slow nuisance than an actual engine card, so we decided he had to go. Glasspool Mimic isn't exactly a direct swap, but the card intrigues us. Originally, we settled on only needing one clone effect running around, and we landed on Vizier of Many Faces as that clone. Glasspool Mimic is a fair bit weaker since it can only clone your own creatures, but it's cheaper to cast, which matters for dedicated tempo decks. And it has the land attached to the back half, which means it'll make the cut in more decks, even in ones where clones aren't a high priority. We considered swapping Vizier for Glasspool Mimic, but we knew we wanted to remove Tezzeret, so we made that swap instead with the intentions of trying out another clone. We only have two swaps in black, the first of which is Command the Dreadhorde, taking the place of Liliana, Waker of the Dead. Yes, we know it's a flavor fail to cut a Lily for a command, but 4-mana Lily has been disappointing to say the least. With minimal graveyard synergies floating around, it's hard to break the parity on Liliana's +1, and there are times where the minus ability doesn't kill the creature you need it to kill. She's unreliable, so she's out, and in her place we're running another big black game ender. Command the Dreadhorde is splashy and a little dangerous as well. There are some decks that can burn you out from a low life total, or even put you in a spot where command becomes uncastable, but in most games where players are trading resource for resource, it's a powerful finisher. It's not necessarily here to stay, we just figured it was worth a trial run, and no, we didn't include the Wanderer for the Wombo combo, so sorry guys. Adding Command the Dreadhorde meant trimming a 4-drop for a 6-drop, so we shaved a little bit off the curve elsewhere by pulling Sir Conrad for Spawn of Mayhem. Black aggro is a real deck, and if you haven't tried it, I suggest dipping your toe in the water a bit because it's super fun. Spawn of Mayhem is a huge threat for black aggro decks to deploy and leads to some busted starts for the deck since it's pretty realistic to land it on turn 3. Sir Conrad is a funny card, too good for the Peasant Cube, just a little bit under par for the Unrestricted Cube. It's not that Conrad's bad, it's just that we've got the Blood Artist effect covered with a number of other creatures and enchantments, and the graveyard-centric parts of Sir Conrad are less relevant in a cube that's short on graveyard synergies. Red's got a few notable changes, with the first being Dragon Master Outcast, who's coming in over Ilharg. Not only is Ilharg a little underwhelming, but it's becoming increasingly clear to us that we just don't need as many late game threats in each color as we currently have. Most red decks have room for only a handful of expensive threats, and they usually want immediate value in the form of hasty creatures or good into the battlefield effects. Ilharg has the same issue as Atali, where it needs to survive an attack to reach its full potential, and it rarely lives through a full turn cycle. Dragon Master Outcast is a bit of an honorary 1-drop. We emphasize how weak our 1-drop aggro sections are due to what's available on Arena, but Dragon Master Outcast doesn't exactly change that. Yes, it technically costs 1 mana, but you're not really supposed to play the card on turn 1 since that exposes it to removal early on. Instead, you're incentivized to wait until you've already hit your 6th land and then cast it, so it's cheating to say that it bolsters our red 1-drop section in a meaningful way. Regardless, it should be a role player, and we're excited to see how it performs. Speaking of excitement, I think there's a subset of players who will be happy to hear that Goblin Chain Whirler's coming in. Mizium Tank was an easy cut since it was one of our 10 least drafted cards overall, and even though it had a bit of potential, it's out for something we expect will get played a bit more. Chain Whirler's a house if you can cast it, and gives red a nice new toy to play around with. It's a tried and true creature, we expect it'll be pretty good here, but it is a bit of a nod towards mono red more than anything else. Keep in mind that Call of the Death Dweller is in fact in the cube, so be prepared to have your board swept at least once with this combo. Perhaps another placeholder swap, we've changed out Rigging Runner for Goblin Motivator. Rigging Runner has been objectively bad. It's not good on turn 1, and even if you manage to pull off the raid ability on turn 2, your reward is a 2/2 First Striker on turn 2, which is not meaningfully better than some random 2-power First Striker you could have played on turn 2 anyway. Riggin' Runner is underwhelming at best and requires setup to get there, and we're happy to get it out of the list. Goblin Motivator is not exactly a windmill slam either, but it has some real potential. Plenty of cards in the Gruul decks are thrilled to pick up haste, so Motivator is playing a bit of a niche role here. It won't be universally good, but you'll notice when it is. Green continues to be our front runner for best color in the unrestricted cube, and we're not messing around with it too much for this update, but we are going to cut Cavalier of Thorns for Tendershoot Dryad. Green has no shortage of fatties that you can ramp into, and while Cavalier is a perfectly fine magic card, we wanted to test out something with a little bit of a different edge to it. Tendershoot Dryad looks to go wide and does so very quickly. It combines a little bit better with Black Sacrifice effects, and it's obviously less color restrictive than the Cavalier. It's a bit of a fragile card as a 5-mana 2/2, but it gets out of hand very quickly if not dealt with immediately. The next card on the list actually came as a suggestion from our community, as it's something Chris and I weren't super high on in our initial pass through the cards. You guys told me you wanted to see Field of the Dead, and well, there you go. One field comes in, one field comes out. It's actually a bit awkward to remove Field of Ruin since it's a safety valve of sorts against Field of the Dead, but outside of specifically that one interaction, Field of Ruin has been close to unplayable. We'll keep our eye on it if Field of the Dead ends up being a problem, which could very well be the case. It's a finisher in the form of a land, so it's close to impossible to interact with, and it's even fetchable with Golos, but it does require you to draft enough non-basics to make it work. Funnily enough, the Zendikar Ryzen double-faced lands count towards the 7 different names you need, so I expect those to be high priorities. Again, our community wanted this, so if you keep losing to Field of the Dead, you know who to talk to. Our other change in the colorless section is Crawlin' Barrens for Relic Amulet. Admittedly, I advocated for Relic Amulet after being impressed with this card in Zendikar Ryzen drafts. It's pulled its weight in Peasant Cube, but it's been a complete dud here. Your control decks just don't have a high density of instants and sorceries, and often have planeswalkers and enchantments filling up those spots instead, so it's hard to get a critical mass of cards to make the relic function. They can't all be winners, and that's fine. Crawlin' Barrens should be pretty powerful. It's an additional manland to go with Mobilized District, and I think we passed over this card at first glance because we just didn't really realize how good it was. It might be innocuous, but it performs as a good attacker and mana sink for monocolored aggressive decks, while also serving as a potential finisher for control decks that tend to leave their mana up on the opponent's turn. I expect to see this card around for a good while. The 3-color gold section has panned out fairly well, I'd say, but only 3 of the 5 cards were really rewarding players for stretching their mana bases, so we're shaking things up with the other 2 slots. The first of these 2 swaps is Korvold for Whirlwind of Thought. Korvold's actually a pretty messed up card, and if you can turn the ETB effect of sacrificing a permanent into an advantage, Korvold becomes actively busted. Even if you're sacrificing real permanents to the triggers, Korvold can become enormous and bury your opponent in card advantage very quickly, so it's pretty close to a kill-on-sight creature. Whirlwind of Thought was a card we seeded for a potential Jeskai control deck, but it turns out the mana is a little more restrictive when you're not playing green, and Whirlwind fell into our 10 least drafted cards list as well, so it's out. And our final change to round things out is another banger with 4-color Omnath taking the place of Chulane. Again, our community really wanted to try this card out, and after some deliberation, we're on board. We gave it a pass the first time around because, frankly, we were upset with how it was playing out in Constructed, but at second glance, it seems a bit tempered in the cube environment. It's not trivial to trigger landfall multiple times in the same turn, since we only have 3 fetch lands in the pool, and 4 colors isn't exactly free, especially given how early our players take the green mana fixin' dorks. Overall, Omnath seems like an exciting, splashy addition to the cube that won't be quite as dominant as it was in other formats. Chulane's a bit of a casualty here since he's not a horrendous card or anything, he's just a bit on the slow side, and there are plenty of cards that can fill his role to much the same effect without asking you to be in 3 colors. Alright, that's it for our quick fix to the Unrestricted Cube. I hope people are excited to try out some of these changes before our Kaldheim update hits in about a month. You can let us know what you think of the changes in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Again, if you're interested in joining the Jank Diver community and want to try out the cube for yourself, you can find a link to our Discord in the description below. That's all I've got this time. Thanks for hanging out. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I will see you all next time.